Good morning. I bet most people feel horribly underqualified at the awesome responsibility of parenthood. I know that I sure do. And I think I feel the weight of it a little bit more than some people because I didn't really have that good of an example for what parenthood should look like when I was growing up. Most people would tell you that parenting is natural, that it's something you just know how to do, and I guess I can affirm that. But I can't help sometimes but wonder, how much better would my parenting be if I had had a good example, to model from? My more negative experiences taught me that there really are two ways to learn something like parenting. You can learn from seeing how the right thing is modeled, or you can learn from seeing how the wrong thing is modeled. One of them is a little bit more confusing. So even if there are cycles of things like violence or neglect or abuse in our families, through God's help, we can break through those things and do something different. Sometimes life throws us some bonus lessons, lessons that we're able to learn that even the people who should be learning them are willing to learn for themselves. Michelangelo, the great Italian artist, not the Ninja Turtle, was an unparalleled artist in his lifetime. Perhaps most famously, he painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He was also one of the greatest sculptors who ever lived. And his description of sculpting and painting, to me, is both succinct and profound. He called painting the art of adding to, and sculpting the art of taking away. During his famous sculpture of King David, maybe many of you have seen it, someone was marveling at how wonderful what he had made was. And they asked him how it was that he was able to accomplish what he did. And he replied, "When I looked at the marble, all I saw was King David. And everything that wasn't David, I simply removed." I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But then again, I'm no master. At times, it's best to understand things by looking at what they're not, by seeing them, asking the questions, what isn't, say, God? What isn't God? Because sometimes when you ask the negative question, it helps define something in ways that just a positive thing doesn't always help. There's some things that are just mysterious, like God or ultimate reality, things that are just completely incomprehensible. And so the theologians have a way of talking about this kind of negative approach. It's called via negativa, the way of the negative, the path of the negative. And Jonah, the book of Jonah is like that. It walks the via negativa. It's a story that explores God's grace by coming from the negative approach. And some lessons come, they're lessons that are there for us, but they come only from learning the hard way, from making the wrong decision and finding out how to test the bounds even there. Some lessons come only by doing things wrong and experiencing the crash and burn for ourselves. By falling, we learn how to pick ourselves up back again and relearn to trust in God. In church, though, we often miss out on this negative examples and experience and how they shape us, because we're not really willing to talk about those things, those lessons that we learned the hard way, the things that shape us and reveal the valuable lesson that comes when we suddenly realize that we've been missing something all along, and we finally find it. For all our talk about repentance and restoration, we have a hard time talking about these lessons we've learned the hard way because they embarrass us a little bit. They make us vulnerable before another person. In church, we don't want to do that because often in the church we shoot our wounded. We don't really respond with grace when someone can offer themselves up in a vulnerable way like that. So it's hard for us to talk about the lessons that we learned from taking the negative path. And Jonah learned some hard lessons this way. He fled God's clear will and went on a journey to actively try to miss God's revealed will for him. Take a stab at bungling God's plan because everything about it smacked of something he didn't like. I think we all have that side of us where we sometimes don't want God's clear plan to succeed because it would benefit someone we have a grudge against or someone who we just we don't want this person sitting next to us in heaven, because maybe heaven wouldn't seem like heaven if that were so to us. And Jonah had this resentment against the Ninevites. He didn't want God to offer them the grace that he knew God wanted to. And so in the Bible, I don't know, you've probably heard this before, but one definition of sin is actually an archery term. It's actually for missing the mark. That's what one definition of sin is. And Jonah wanted that. He wanted to miss the mark. He was supposed to be pointed toward Nineveh, and he pointed himself the complete wrong direction. He pointed himself to the place he could imagine as the farthest place where there was still a civilization in the world. He wanted to miss going to Nineveh. And I think we all have experiences where we disobey God, and what we don't realize sometimes when we do that is we become numb in our disobedience. Like a driver asleep at the wheel, we don't realize how far gone we really are. And disobeying God is one of those things that can get easier and easier until it becomes that proverbial slippery slope where we find the big crash at the bottom. And here we find Jonah purposeless, sleeping on the job, choosing not to serve as the prophetic witness that he was called to be, refusing to carry out his primary purpose as a prophet of bringing God's message to people broken by sin. So when we hear the story of Jonah, I think it's good to ask ourselves now and then, where do we need to wake up to the music of our spiritual life? Like Jonah, we can find ourselves sleeping on the job, off somewhere missing the plans and purposes that God has for us. Our unwillingness to follow God can leave us spiritually lethargic, kind of out of it, missing what God is doing right now, as Scott was telling us about this morning. Out of touch, and maybe even just trying to bide our time until we get a check out of this world and hopefully go off to heaven. When Sophie was younger, about 2, she had this really nasty habit of trying to wake me up whenever I take a nap. She just refused to let me take a nap. And sometimes I'd come home tired, construction worker, after doing homework all night and working hard on the job, and I just kind of, phase out on the couch for a little bit. And she just walked up to me. It was her little 2-year-old hand, and it was gentle because she was 2, but she meant it, and she just slapped me right in the face. If you've ever experienced something like that. I'm so thankful she doesn't do that anymore, but probably Greta's going to start doing that anytime now. So, anyway, sometimes God's answer to disobedience comes across like that. It comes up like a wake-up call. It hits us like a smack in the face. And Jonah had tried to run halfway across the world in the wrong direction. He tried to escape his circumstances by sinking his head into a pillow, covering himself up with blankets, as you can see in the picture behind me. But it wasn't enough. He would soon realize that the God of the universe isn't somebody that you can run from. He's not a pushover that's just going to let you get your way. And when we run from God's plans, when we don't like them, as Jonah did, it doesn't take long for our lives to turn into a giant mess. At least if you're like me. Maybe some of you could do that and your life wouldn't turn into a mess, but for me, that's how it always goes. And when we shut our ears to God, like Jonah did, we don't just miss out on God's I love yous now and then. We also miss out on warnings. God's asking us to turn away from the direction that we're going. We probably don't think about it too much in Iowa, but the sea is actually one of the most dangerous places on the planet. Probably most of you have been there. Has anyone ever been to the sea? You guys are a bunch of landlubbers. Anyway, we have Doppler radar now, and we have accurate weather prediction. That sure takes a lot of the mystery out of the sea, but if you've ever been on the sea for longer than about 15 minutes, you soon realize that it's a force beyond your control. In the ancient world, the sea was always symbolic of the forces of chaos, and there's probably many, many ancient stories such as Jonah that reveal the wrath of a god of some kind by a storm at sea, the power and the awe of a storm at sea. This is a dangerous, dangerous thing that's happening. And the Hebrew idiom for this storm of the sea actually has this, it's kind of funny, it has this picture of the sea getting up and walking around. It's just crazy. That's how they're trying to describe. This is a storm with waves that are tall and just frightening. In the original language, it speaks of the boat. I didn't plan for the message to be read this morning, but I like how the message brings out that idea that the boat was just about to break apart, because that's how dramatic this is in the original language. And this is the moment when the worst fears of these sailors is about to come true. And here we find Jonah trying to drown his sorrows in a pillow. He's completely unconscious. I had the privilege of going through this book in a bunch of different languages for school. In the Septuagint, the Greek, it actually says that Jonah was snoring because it's trying to describe him as completely unconscious, as completely out of it, dead to the world. So we find that the prophet, the person who's the most likely person to hear from God, completely asleep at the wheel. And yet these pagan sailors in the story, they're fully aware that something is not right up in heaven. If you were a commercial sailor, you wouldn't throw your commercial goods overboard. That's the whole reason you were probably on the boat ride in the first place. That's the payload. You don't throw that stuff overboard unless you're not sure that you're going to get out with your life and you're willing to do anything to survive. In literature, I don't know if you've ever taken a literature class, but literature, they have these characters called foils. And they function solely to flesh out the main character of the story, to show us the boundaries of who they are and help us to define them. They're called foils because, like a piece of tin foil, they wrap around something else. And Jonah is a multi-layered story, because when you see all these characters kind of flattened around Jonah. Jonah is sort of like a foil on his own. He's kind of a hollow character. He's full of anger and reluctance and bitterness. He never has that rise of the hero that we might expect. He never has that downfall of humanity. It's almost like a comedy, and Jonah is the fool. And there's no evidence that he ever learned the lessons that his story was designed to illustrate, that he ever got to grasp this God that he was really the foil of to reveal. And so the other characters wrap themselves around Jonah, but the big secret character, the big main character of the story is really God. And Jonah's crazy actions are wrapped around the person and the grace of God. And the irony of the book of Jonah is really breathtaking. It's the most unlikely character in the story that behaves the most rationally. It's these pagan sailors who are the first ones to pray, to call out to God for divine assistance to save them. As I said last week, Jonah kind of functions like the bad guy in the story. There's a song in the VeggieTales movie, I don't know if you've ever heard that, but there's a song written about Jonah, and it kind of describes this. I'm not going to sing it for you because you wouldn't like that. But it says, Jonah was a prophet, ooh, ooh, but he never really got it, sad but true. And there's just something unsatisfying about reading Jonah. We kind of want him to get it. We want him to understand the heart of God that he is playing into, but he never quite does. And that's because I think disobedience causes this kind of spiritual attention deficit disorder that plays out in our lives. At times, God has to give us a big wake-up call to break through our denial because we just never might get around to breaking through it ourselves and waking up to the possibility that we're completely missing the boat with God. There's this line from a movie, Cool Hand Luke, and he says, what we have here, some men you just can't reach, And Jonah's about to find out that the God of the universe, his reach was inescapable. The psalmist writes, where can I go from your spirit? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. I wish Jonah would have read that before he went on his adventure. And the thing about God is we can never really get away from him. Even when we turn from God, it's really not turning from God. It's just putting our head into the sand, pretending that he's not there. And sometimes it takes a huge mess before we realize that's what we have done, how far off the mark we have come. And God has a way of even using people we might not suspect, people who don't even follow him sometimes, to snap us out of it and wake us back up. So disobedience can have drastic consequences, yet God keeps giving us grace, even when that grace comes like a wake-up call. The opportunity to cry out to God in our distress and deal with the messes we have made, to deal with the heart issue that's underneath it all, that comes out when we run from God. And so we find God chasing after us like a parent, sometimes like an angry parent. It doesn't mean God doesn't love us, that he gives us a wake-up call now and then. But it does mean something is deeply wrong in our relationship. And we need to listen to God. We need to get back to God to fix it, because we just can't keep running forever. So like a parent, God doesn't just let us have our way. He won't let us short-circuit his plans just because we don't like them. We can't, through our defiance or escapism, change the will of God. It's just not possible. And I really identify with Jonah because I have felt like I ran from God. I have a penchant for self-destruction, and God's grace has met me like this time after time. And grace takes many forms. Sometimes it's just the opportunity to turn back one more time, to get back on the right track again, and to be obedient once again and walk with God. And so God often gives us that grace before we get to that point where there's just no turning back. And as we see in the next section, God doesn't just give Jonah the opportunity for a new start. He actually gives Jonah a ride back to square one. A new chance at a fresh start. It's easy to miss the grace of a wake-up call if you've never experienced it. To see this only as God punishing Jonah and not about a nudge back into the right direction. But God could have given up on Jonah. God had every right and every reason probably to give up on Jonah. God knew Jonah would drag his feet. He could have called someone to give up on Jonah. He gave Jonah a second chance, the only way that Jonah was going to hear it, this crazy storm. And some of us need that, but we need the bold print, we need that flashing yellow sign from God now and then, that we are drifting away. God, in his grace, he gives it to us. When we try to plug our ears to God's voice, he pumps up the volume until we're willing to face the music once again. So as we go into our time of will and worship, I have 3 queries that I'd like you to wrestle with. I know we've gone a little bit over, but as we go into this time, I want you to reflect on these 3 questions and how you have experienced standing in Jonah's shoes and experienced the grace of God. Where have you experienced big grace? The grace of God breaking through your disobedience and denial. Have you ever felt the wrath of God nudge you back onto the right path once again? Or have the righteousness of an unbeliever make you wake up to the reality of your own sin? If you hear from God, I encourage you to stand and share that message with us. We believe that God is still speaking, that he will speak even now. And so if you feel led to speak, stand, and a microphone will be brought to you. Please use it, because lots of people can't hear you about it. Thank you.